Welcome to Pax Europiana. I'm very honored to have Professor Xhepa today with us. We will discuss about Albanian economic transition and the last 30 years, which were very turbulent in Albania, but also very successful. And I'm very honored that Professor Xhepa, who is a professor at the European University of Tirana for economic policy, but also was a member of the parliament of Albania and one of the key inspirators and leaders of the Albanian economic miracle since 2005, the great process of transformations which happened during Prime Minister Berisha. And I would like to welcome you very much on the show on Pax Europiana, and also give you the opportunity to introduce yourself a little bit, what you're doing, what's your contribution, and thanks a lot for accepting the invitation. Please, Professor.
Yeah, thank you very much, Günther, for inviting me in this talk. It is a great pleasure for me too. Actually, I'm very honored to have known you a lot in your frequent visits in Albania, and a lot of roundtable and discussions that we hold on several topics with keen interest for the transition economies, and particularly on the Albanian context. Me, myself, I have been living this transition in several let's say, occupations or professions. As a professional, I have been working for a couple of years in a research department. I've been working on a Center for International Trade, also trying to help and assist the government.
No, I cannot hear you. Yes, very good.
You cannot hear me?
No, it was for a moment it was broken, but it's fine again.
Yeah. So and later I joined the Prime Minister's office in economic policies, and later I became member of Parliament, member of the Standing Committee on Finance and Budget. And on the last 10 years, I'm working on the university. So that's my first profession that I started my career in my life early in the 90s. So that's basically and how I've been experiencing and living through this transition and turbulent times.
It was turbulent, Professor, absolutely. Can you also elaborate a bit, because there was this famous visit of James Baker in 91, the opening of Albania. And when he came, and there were 300,000 Albanians on the streets, and it was an amazing event. Yeah, can you a little bit elaborate how you experienced these moments of transition and freedom for Albania?
Well, I think these have been the most exciting times in Albanian history. And it's not just because it's not only for me, myself, but also from the memories of even the older generations. I mean, for a country of experiencing such a very harsh and repressive regime, I think the fall down of the Berlin Wall, and basically the freedom that was touching this part of the world, this corner of the world. I think that was really an amazing time. So the visits of global leaders, like, for example, as I said, the ex-Secretary of State James Baker, but also other important personalities from Europe, I think were historical events. I mean, in the context of a very closed economy, or a very closed society, a repressed society, that from these times. But there were also times of hope, because every visit of a foreign leader was seen as a hope for the country. So that were experienced in very much inspiring very much enthusiasm among the Albanian population. I think we have some problems with the connection with the internet.
No, it's working good. It's working good.
Oh, sorry, because I had the message here is that the internet was unstable. So these were moments of hope and inspiration. And basically, when I put myself on the memories of the time, I think that was so much hope that the country was going to change in a decade. But later we understood that change takes time. So we had to work so hard and make these changes possible.
Professor, can you also describe what was the legacy of communism in Albania? What was the status of the economic situation, the infrastructure, the situation in that years, in the beginning of the 90s?
Well, I think Albania was by far the poorest countries, not only in Europe, but I think one of the poorest countries in the world. We started the economic transition in early 91, 92 by a very low level of GDP of below 300 US dollars per capita. So you can understand that that poverty was massive, was widespread. Uh, I mean, the country had invested huge resources in building mega industries, based on the principle that we have to build everything on our own, which was an exhaustion of the resources and I think a misuse of the resources. So basically, the whole economic system was collapsing. Even before the communism was coming down, I think that the industries were already a failure. So basically, all the industries were closed, and all people stayed at home and got a minimum salary, staying home. So that shows that the initial conditions of the transition uh, had a very strong impact. I mean, even from the evidences of or empirical evidences on the determinants of transition, the initial conditions show that they had the most important effect on the performance of the transition reforms that were to be undertaken on this time. So the country was, I mean, with the lack of infrastructure, industries were collapsing. There was almost a full unemployment in all country. Poverty was widespread, as I said. So basically, this is the way that the country initiated the transition reforms.
And Professor, there was this phase, which is also very interesting in Albanian history, with China, the cooperation, and the Chinese doing the industrialization of Albania. And can you describe in what condition this project of the Chinese were in the 90s, then when they were assessed, please?
Well, Albania during the communist time had several occasional friends, and we changed often the friends. So first we're in close friendship with the Yugoslavs of Tito at the time, and later we became friends with Russia. And when the Albanian communists, divorced with the Russian, and basically the other Warsaw Treaty member countries. So we basically went under China because of political realities at that time and geopolitical, if we say realities, between the socialist family of countries. So starting from I think mid 1960s till the end of 70s, or basically 77, 78, Albania was very much and largely financed by China. So China was a key investor in terms of financing the major projects on the industrialization, and not only that, but also on the military side. So there has been quite a lot of influence of the Chinese technology, and many enterprises, big, large enterprises on steel, for example, paper, and many other industrial products, chemicals industry, were largely invested by Chinese technology. So, but given that the relations broke, on 78, the relations between Albania and China broke, so the economy was unable to survive and feed itself. So therefore, this large state-owned companies started to face difficulties in the 80s. And when we look on the growth rates on the 80s, I mean, the breakdown of communism was already announced from the times. We had in several episodes negative growth rates. And for the whole decade of the 80s, growth rates were at around 3% of GDP, which basically where the economy was really exhausting itself and living on accumulated reserves since the time of China.
So it was very difficult conditions for transition. And the real transition came then in March 92, when the first democratic elections, which led to a change in the government. And it was the Democratic Party and President Berisha from 92 to 96. Can you describe the economic reforms of that time?
Yes. Yeah, actually, myself, I happened to be on the time the chairman of Foreign Investment Promotion Agency. And it was an agency that trying to sell the image of Albania in internet. And it is great because we had to attract foreign investors in a country which had no laws, we had no institutional framework on place. So I had the experiences, for example, of some joint ventures that were on the court when they had disputes, and they used the family code for the divorce of the company, because we had no we had no laws on the bankruptcy, for example, or institutional framework for. It has been quite an exciting, and some very key and important reforms were undertaken actually in the very early of 1993. The new government, democratic government in place. The major reform was the price liberalization.
What is very important, Professor, don't put the hands on the computer microphone, please. That's very
Oh,
important.
I see. I see. Yes.
Okay.
Okay.
It was price liberalization, Professor.
Exactly, the price liberalization was the most critical, important reform, given, as I said, the social conditions were very harsh, and there was a large spread to poverty in the country. Price liberalization, with an inflation spike of 239%, it was an amazing challenging time from the government, because if the price of essential goods, were increasing dramatically. So let's say, I think these were really very tough times. Later, the government started with a major privatization process. So basically, particularly small and medium-sized enterprises, flats, apartments, shops, all the services, existing services. And this was a major and radical ownership transformation in the country. The start of these transition reforms were on the agriculture. So basically, the giving land back to the farmers, that was an essential, important step in the reforms, given that Albania had mostly more than 50% of population living in the countryside, and agriculture was a major sector, contributing to employment and to feeding the population all the time. So I think, and by that, slowly we started to build the new legislation. In 93, we had a new legislation on foreign investments, for example, and a lot of commercial code and all the pieces of legislation in order to establish a framework that was appropriate for foreign investors. On the other hand, we had a lot of fiscal incentives, given that we were, a country with no institutions in place and no infrastructure and so on. So the country was offering, a lot of fiscal incentives for foreign companies. And starting from 93, 94, Albania started to appear in the map of foreign investors. We had the pioneers of foreign investors at the time, for example, Coca-Cola, which is a symbol of foreign investors in transition economies. So we were moving quite aggressively on the time, but unfortunately, this dynamics of and positive results of transition were hardly impaired by the social crisis of 1997, which clearly, sent a negative message in foreign investors and the community, and that was a real pity for the dynamics of reforms in this country.
So the first Berisha mandate was very good with a lot of economic reforms, but the task was to build up the whole country basically as a market economy. It was definitely very challenging. Then came the 96 elections, and then came also the global financial crisis of 97. And it's also, I think, the economic framework of Albania was still young, and it was a very complicated moment, the breakdown of the pyramids. It's gone in history. Maybe you can describe from economic perspective what was happening at these difficult days.
Yeah, I think the history with the pyramids, it's not an exclusively an Albanian history. Actually, we learned this from the history of pyramids, in many other parts of the world, and starting from the Second World War. It was a phenomenon that was also affecting many other transition economies. But what was unusual in Albania was the dimension of a phenomenon. Basically, more than 30-40% of GDP, in terms of the value, was involved in the pyramid schemes. And the dynamics of this phenomenon were dramatically increasing, particularly after 1996. So after the elections of 1996, the dynamics were increasing. and large segments of population got involved, in these schemes. From the economic perspective, definitely this was something quite destabilizing, because it discouraged the work, for example. It discouraged investors. So basically, I mean, and mobilized resources in a very inefficient way. So it was challenging the banking system and financial sector. So there were quite a lot of failures, I would say, in the way that a typical market economy had to work. But we have to understand also the context. Albania didn't have a developed banking system. We had just a very few state-owned banks. So there were credit rationing. I mean, the loans and credit to economy was so much rationed and scarce. So there, I mean, in a market or in a society that there are no markets developed, so the alternative of going in informal market and informal channels, I think it's quite usual, even in other economies. So we have to understand the state of development was quite weak in order to absorb these large negative shocks.
So that was a very difficult year, but unfortunately also the year 98 and 99 with the international mission, but also then the Kosovo War and the Kosovo Liberation War of NATO. That was obviously having a big impact on Albania as well. And can you elaborate what was the situation in these years from 97 to 99?
Yeah. Well, I think that the whole night is where quite I would say destabilizing, because Albania is part of the Balkan, and in the Balkan in the 90s you had quite a lot of wars. It was so much turmoil in the region. So if you say that you went to invite foreign investors in the Balkans, it looks like inviting investors in Saigon, back in the Vietnam Wars or in Korean Wars. It was basically, this kind of historical parallel I would like to make. So despite the internal instability, with the pyramid schemes, and later in 1998, as you said, because of political let's say, instability in the country, and I would say till the end of this first decade of transition, I would say that Albania experienced several episodes of negative shocks, both in terms of the impact from the outside, but also in terms of internal political developments. So I would say that it was only in the second decade of the transition that Albania started to become a normalized, I would say, economy. But let me say that the first decade of transition laid the ground, for major accomplishments during the second decade, because I mean, a full legislation was already in place. So basically, all aspects of economic life and social life were already regulated by laws. So we had a new institutional framework in place, and also, despite these negative shocks, Albania recovered, the complete fall in output that we experienced with the breakdown of the system. So basically, by 1999 or early 2000, the level of GDP was basically 100% of the pre-transition period, which is an amazing, because in other transition economies, this recovery of the output loss it took even more than 1 decade. In some countries, it took more than a decade and a half. So from this perspective, I think that there are quite a lot of successes, but also enormous failures during this time.
Albania was very challenged also with a lot of refugees during the Kosovo War, and also the impact of the Kosovo War. And then after liberation, when peace was in the Balkans in the year 2000, there was a socialist government in Albania. And can you describe their kind of economic policies? I think there was a lot of monopolies, cartels, and a lot of licensing. And can you describe these phases of the beginning of the reconstruction 2000 to 2005?
Yes, that is true. I mean, with the coming of the new socialist government, actually, the socialist government came in power since 1998, and the business books, became like the War and Peace of Tolstoy. So you add chapters and you add chapters and you add bureaucracy on the system, and the system becomes so complex that rather than being a pocketbook, understanding the investment climate becomes so confusing, so complicating, adding layers of administrative barriers on the system. So yeah, that is true. And step by step, I think that the economy was or let's say market were not really on a perfect competition in the sense that there was not a lot of competition on the system. There were quite a lot of market concentration, market powers, concentrated in a few hands of businesses, which basically, but on the other hand, on the positive side, the privatization program process continued. So even the governments on the time started to privatize large segments of the economy. Banks, for example, were privatized, telecommunications were privatized, and other major industries which were still under the government control were privatized. Some pioneering contracts on concession contracts were awarded, and in this case I refer to Arena's airport. So there were quite a lot of good episodes, but when you see, the broader perspective, in terms of how the small private sector, for example, worked, there were quite a lot of bureaucracy on the system. So yeah, that made and that impacted also the growth rates, because if you see the growth rates from this time, you see that the growth rates in economy continue to decline.
But then came the decisive year of 2005, which is seen, I
Yes.
think, the economic miracle, the start of the economic miracle, the real growth and reform phase. And you were personally also involved in that one. Can you describe the situation, the context?
I think that 2005 made a major difference in terms of the business environment in the country. We launched three very important reforms. Number one was reforming the complete establishment of investors in the country. We inherited in a system that if you had to start a business, you had to get permissions from the court to register the company in the court, which is a complete nonsense, because the right to undertake any economic activity is a constitutional right, is a freedom of any individual. So what we did actually, we brought all this system out of the court system, and we established a normal procedure so every business could be registered in one day, could be registered with €1, and it made all this kind of bureaucracy and high tax country. We became or high. I mean, the fiscal burden to register a company was enormously going down, and only with this measure, Albania improved enormously the classification or the ranking in the Doing Business Guide of the World Bank. We became immediately the 42nd country in the world in terms of easiness to establish a business. The second major reform was on the taxation. So we smoothed the procedures. We installed an electronic platform, so filing and paying taxes could be done automatically through the technology, and therefore that made also an enormous improvement in the bureaucracy of taxation and easing the relation between business and the tax administration. The third major and pillar of reform was reforming the public procurement. The public procurement, which was also a key concern, because that's where corruption usually stands. This public money that is used in a non-transparent way and owned by very few business operators. This creates a lot of corruption opportunities. What we did, we installed e-procurement. So basically, all procurement process has again to be done through the technology and using technology. That also made a great improvement because the competition in this system increased enormously, and savings, from the budget in terms of expenditures were amazing. I mean, only the first year we saved on average 13% of the planned funds, allocated for investment, public investments. These three major improvements, I think they made quite a lot of impact in terms of bureaucracy and reducing the bureaucracy in the economy. Then we continue the reforms with the fiscal reform, not in terms of administration, but in terms of reviewing the whole normative taxation tax rates. Basically, we applied a new system with a flat tax, going from a 15% tax on profits to a 10% that was applied on all the kinds of income, the economy, profit, dividends, interest, wages, and all kinds of income. So basically, we made a system, broadened the system of taxation, and that yielded quite a lot of impressive results, because even from the first year, incomes on the government improved by an average 118 million euros, and the second year by another 220 million euros. So these reforms yielded quite a lot of impressive results. And finally, we established a task force on regulatory reform, which basically was to deregulate and not to regulate. So what we did on this time, we reviewed the whole legislation, particularly in terms of licensing, offering, giving the license or other administrative and bureaucratic procedures, to create an environment that was really conducive to foreign investors. And the results so show enormous yield, because we had major investors on this time. We had the largest foreign direct investments coming in this country, a transatlantic pipeline. We have Statkraft, building the largest hydropower system. We had major Austrian companies in the country building on the energy sector. Only the energy was attracting more billions of euros, during this period. But also we try to liberalize the market for Albanian operators as well. So even from the perspective of local operators, we had more than €500 million, loan exposure to foreign investors, only for investments in the energy sector. So basically, the economic growth was reaching close to 8% of GDP, which was basically really an amazing moment in the history of Albanian economy.
So you were one of the first countries to digitalize the public procurement system, but also having
exactly.
flat tax, and it led to a major boom of foreign investment. Can you outline some of the key investments? You mentioned already one, but explain also for the audience, what is the Trans-Adriatic pipeline and what are these energy projects, for example? What is the meaning and the significance also for whole of Europe?
Yeah, as I said, a major, in our view, energy sector was to be the driving force, for the economic growth and for focusing all the attention of public policies. The idea is that Albania is a country rich of energy resources, which were actually unused. And on the other hand, we have quite a disbalanced energy system in the country, because we suffer a lot of energy interruption. In 2005, 2008, Albania, was, particularly during the winter season, there were quite a lot of supply by using generators. So all industries were basically increasing high cost, fixed costs of their enterprises, because they had to supply and produce their own energy by using generators. So this was a major problem for our economy, and therefore most of the focus from our policy was on the energy sector. We worked on this respect first with the renewable energy sources, and therefore the whole we applied a philosophy of cascade, exploiting in the cascade system, in order to allow us an efficient use of the water resources. Major companies, as I said, were involved, and Statkraft was one of the, as it's known, is one of the largest European energy producers. So they built, and they are right now, they completed three major, the third major hydropower in this cascade, and then with investments of, I think it's around 1.2 billion euros. Then we lobbied for a gas project. Albania is different from all the other countries in the Balkan, has no connection with the gas supply. So we had to connect we had to lobby actually to bring Albania in the gas network. So for this, we lobbied with European Commission, I think, and many other partners, so that this Trans-Adriatic pipeline bringing gas, from Azerbaijan through Turkey and Greece, and then passing through Albania and then going to Italy and then to Europe. And this is also something critical because first it gives access Albania to a gas network, to a gas supply, and then we can diversify the energy resources. We can also build thermal power stations fueled by gas, and but also it brings Albania in the map of geostrategic networks of pipelines. So this is also something very, very, very important for us. But it's not only this, because Albania was very successful also in attracting a lot of other foreign investors in many other major industries that particularly in the manufacturing, for example, or other segments of the, or in telecommunications, for example, in the banking industry, so in service industry in general.
So this was very successful phase in reforming the economy. I call it the Albanian economic miracle. It was high growth rates, but it was also very strong in the infrastructure, because also there was a lot of pent-up demand. And can you describe the infrastructure achievements of this period?
Right. Yeah, the public investments on this time was very much focused on renewing the infrastructure of the country. As I said, Albania was one of the countries with the poorest level of infrastructure. If you see, for example, the indices of the EBRD on the transition report of the EBRD, and other, for example, reports of the World Bank in terms of measuring the level of sophistication of infrastructure, Albania performs poorly. So we focused most of our investments, public investments, on the road networks. So in this time, we built, the largest segments of the national road. We built the highway from Durrës to Pristina, for example, which is one of the largest investment projects of the time, and it really was a massive, providing good incentives, to economic growth. But in addition to the major national networks, we focused largely on rural infrastructure, and also infrastructure that was targeting the tourism industry. Basically, all the segments of the countryside and in the seaside could be reached by asphalt network, which was actually a real major impact, not only both in terms of improving the productivity in the agriculture sector and reducing the cost and fighting poverty in the countryside, but also in terms of giving some contribution to the tourism sector, which is a major potential for the future of Albania's economic development.
In 2008, the world was hit by the global financial crisis, but with this smart kind of multi-level strategy, also focusing very much on the tourism sector, Albania managed quite well through the great financial crisis. What's your take on that?
Exactly. I think that Albania was one of the countries that was largely protected from this crisis. I mean, if you see, the recession hit many of our neighbor countries, North Macedonia, Montenegro, Serbia, but Albania managed to remain on the positive growth rate, which actually were quite reducing very fast, but still they were positive. And remaining on positive growth rate was a major achievement because, as you know, this global crisis, hit even the strongest economies in the world. So I think that one of the key reasons for this was because of the still large fiscal stimulus that we adopted, particularly on the projects on the infrastructure, as I mentioned. So this large negative shock impact was smooth because of this fiscal stimulus that we adopted on the economy during this period of time. But still, if you see, the growth rate continues to decrease, and I think that the legacy of this crisis is already still there. Because starting from 2011, 2012, if you see, the growth rates continue to go down, and we remain on an average growth rate of less than 3%, which is basically a very low growth rate, and on such growth rates, the country is cannot offer new jobs, decent jobs, and fight poverty, and all this cope with all this social agenda that we are facing.
In 2011, there was also an internal Albanian crisis in the beginning of 2011, and as well there was the Greek debt crisis. And given the strong interlinks between the Albanian and the Greek economy, what's your take? How complicated was this years 2011-13 for you?
Yeah, actually, I mean that was one of the key reasons why the crisis was felt actually late than in EU countries. If in the EU countries started in 2008, in this part of the world, in Albania in particular, the crisis started to felt by 2011, and particularly due to the large influence of the Greek debt crisis. You know that Albania has a large community of Albanians living and working in Greece, but also in Italy. And Italy also was also very largely hit, very strongly hit by this crisis. So given that Albania has very strong economic ties in terms of the foreign direct investments, in terms of trade relations. So basically 60-70% of our trade is counting on these two countries, particularly on the export side. Remittances are a key component of incomes for many families in Albania, and incomes from remittances account for more than 1.2 billion euros annually, which actually are a key financial channel that links Albania with the neighboring economies of Greece and Italy. So the crisis in these two countries definitely had a very strong impact, and that is the key reason why growth rates in Albania started to decline steeply.
In 2013, there was the next general election, and then came the socialist government in power again. And can you assess some of the economic reforms and what was happening economically then in the years 2013 to 17?
Yes. Well, I think that the major difference was that in 2013, the new government of the Socialist Party, they changed again the taxation system, which is quite unfit, because we could have given a chance, to this policy, and to see if this could yield good results, and better results in terms of promoting higher economic growth. So basically, we shifted again from a low flat tax to a tax system on progressive taxation with higher marginal top tax rates up to 23%. And that basically, and in addition to this new tax policies, I think more administrative layers were added on the system. Basically, what we see now after a large period of time, I think we have two terms of this left-wing government on place, and we see that still markets are lacking competition. We still see that due to both policies, but also to the implementation of policies, we see that large market segments are still captured by a few number of companies, and I think this is the most serious weakness in the Albanian economy. And in my view, that largely explains why the growth rates in Albania have not been increasing, and we are stuck in a very low growth rate, in a very bad equilibrium, both in terms of incomes to the budget and also in terms of the opportunities to influence the social agenda in the country.
So there was one of the biggest tax increases in European history, from 10 to 23, more than double. That was, of course, a big shock. Additionally, my question is also when you compare the speed of reforms, because I remember in 2005, Prime Minister Berisha, he came with a strong dynamic. Every month, basically, there was a major economic reform package in the parliament. There was a labor market, land market, everything was
Absolutely.
monthly. And how dynamic is the economic policy of Prime Minister Rama in 2013-14?
Well, actually, we see very few of the government actions, because there is not so high transparency, much transparency in terms of what the government does. We used to have weekly open meetings of the government in Albania. So basically the media, and in each meeting there was a major initiative announced and new reforms announced. But with the Socialist Party, I think, and with socialist government in place, we see very few of government actions. Basically, I mean, we learn from newspapers and in a very delayed time that what are the initiatives that are discussed on the government. So I would say that there is there is a lack of transparency. But on the other hand, we see that there have been a lot of action in terms of particularly in terms of public-private initiatives, this kind of partnerships, and I think that has created a lot of let's say troubles in the economy, in my view, because we are not very much certain in terms of the contingent liabilities that are created in the public finance. So we are not very much aware now that or certain that what is the level of public debt, for example, because if you account for these contingent liabilities, the value of public debt would be much higher. So there is quite a lot of, in my view, problems associated with the accountability and the responsibility of the government authorities.
So, Professor Xhepa, let me ask you, the key historic achievement of Prime Minister Berisha was obviously NATO membership in 2009. Together with Croatia, you were invited to join the Alliance of the West, historic achievement. And Croatia was then able in 2013 to join the European Union. And one of the key arguments of the left-wing government was they will be able to bring Albania, similar like Croatia, in the European Union. And in the beginning, it looked like that in 2014. But now, to my best knowledge, Albania in 2021 is still not in the European Union. And exactly, can you explain your perspective on that?
Yeah, I think it's a sad story because from the European Union side, I think there's been always a very nice attitude toward Albania. I think the EU has always been in favor of supporting Albanian reforms, but unfortunately, we have been lacking so many opportunities to join this family. The history starts, I think, since 1996, maybe, when we lost due to political turmoil that happened in this time in this country. But then several other opportunities were also missed. In 2006, we signed the Stabilization and Association Agreement, and from that time till today, we see no further development rather than just this institutional agreement that we have in place. We also had some very important reforms in terms of border control, for example, that made Albania gave Albania access to visa-free travel in Europe, and I think that also a major accomplishment also for the government of Democratic Party on that time, which together with the NATO membership, I think, are the two largest accomplishments in terms of integrating Albania in the family of European family. So, but from this time, I think there have been quite a lot of I would not say regress, but the progress has been extremely slow, and the country is facing again a lot of conditions because most of the agenda still depends on the political reform. And as we know, the Copenhagen criteria are political criteria because they have to meet with the rule of law, with the level of democratic development and institutions. And all these are related to reform of the justice system, for example, to the election system, and many other let's say conditions that the country has to respect in order to convince the European nations that the country is moving on the right direction in terms of democratic development of the country.
So looking back to the last 8 years now of the government of Edi Rama, let me ask you, what were the major achievements in terms of infrastructure, in terms of new foreign direct investments, or big economic reform packages?
Well, I think that the largest investment project that is undertaken by the current government is the urban renaissance that we call Rilindia Urbana, which is also let's say expanded on the rural side. 100 villages that were selected, to improve the infrastructure and all basically that have a great potential in terms of tourism activity. I think this is the largest major project that is undertaken by the current government, and in my view, so the results show that it has been a very good project because basically, this urban rehabilitation and renovation, I think it has changed dramatically, the faces of the cities, and it has created a lot of opportunities and potential, particularly for tourism sector. And if you see, for example, the tourism industry has been booming in these years. I mean, the number of tourists visiting the country and incomes of the economy from tourism are reaching basically the level of incomes from the exports of goods, which shows that we have a very important potential that is starting really to work nicely. But other than this, I think that I find it very hard actually myself to see that where I can find other major reforms from this government. Well, there have been efforts to control this construction process in the country, so to discipline basically the illegal buildings and the illegal use of territories. But other than this, which are basically not major reforms, but they are actions of the government in the implementation of the legislation in place. But these are good contributions. But other than this, I think I find it hard to find, let's say, other episodes of positive contribution to growth.
I have personally been in Korča, for example, Berat and in Shkodra, and these inner city revitalizations are really very beautiful. I think it's also an important achievement, there's no doubt. And that's also for many of the regional countries to see and to also copy. But also, for example, when you look at Macedonia, they have achieved something which I think is very impressive. I would like to ask you about the land register in Albania, because all these renovation projects, all the tourism investment, they need also a decent process of land rights, land access, urban planning. And Macedonia has a global best system in that one in terms of transparency, European cadastre. I would like to ask what was achieved now in the last 8 years in this sector, important sector in Albania.
Well, in my view, nothing substantial, nothing important. We still continue to face the same problems as the old. I mean, this is an old problem, an unsolved one, except for some administrative rearrangements. For example, the consolidation of all the offices in one office to have just one cadastre. I mean, in my view, there are no other substantial improvement. There is still a lot of, many parts, large segments of land, for example, are still, are not issued the proper title of ownership. So we are still lacking behind in terms of building a real and functional land market in the country. Because unless this process is completed, I mean, the unsettled property rights still continue to be a barrier to foreign direct investments. Therefore, if you see all the laws on foreign direct investments, try to give insurance investors, but on the other hand, sometimes this comes in contradiction with protecting the property rights for the real owners of the land. So I think that we are, in my view, much behind that experience of Northern Macedonia, and maybe this should be targeted as one of the key institutional reforms by the next government.
Professor, let me also ask you, in 2014, Angela Merkel, the German Chancellor, has invited all the Balkan countries to the so-called Berlin for the Balkans process in order to improve the interconnectivity of the countries, especially in terms of highways. One of the key projects was promised to be the Adriatic Highway to connect Tirana and the amazing tourism places of Albania better with Austria, where I live, and then to drive easily, because we have a lot of tourists in Poland, in Germany, who would love to drive to Croatia, Montenegro, Albania. And how many more kilometers were built in Albania in the Adriatic Highway since 2014, please?
I think no kilometers were built, because not a single one, because Albania was not able to attract finance through the building process, unfortunately. So And I think that this is basically due to the fact that Albania is in a very, I think, dangerous, I would call, budget deficit level. So we are at a budget deficit of around public debt of around 80% of GDP, and therefore the fiscal space, for the government to attract new money either through building process or other opportunities to attract new money. For example, even from the China project of the Belt Road, for example. So we have not been able to attract any single project. So in the 8 years, I think not even a single kilometer was paved by accessing the funds through this building process.
Let me ask you also.
Peter, I think I have to apologize because now I have to enter in another meeting. So
okay,
maybe a final question, and I have to stop.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Professor, for all this. Maybe you're ready for a second debate where we can discuss about the future economic projects. That would be also good. Maybe in the coming days, we can agree on a second process. And thanks a lot for your insights, for your knowledge, and for your personal contribution also for this amazing country, Albania, for the economic reforms. Professor Xhepa, thanks a lot for talking to Pax Europiana.
Thank you very much, Günther. Thanks a lot. Have a nice day. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.